Emotional exhaustion does something profound to the human psyche. It strips away fantasy. When a person reaches this state, they are no longer driven by hope that things might change, nor by fear that things might collapse. Both illusions dissolve at the same time. This is why an emotionally exhausted victim becomes so psychologically formidable. Not louder, not aggressive, but clear. Carl Jung spoke often about the danger of the unconscious, not because it is evil, but because it operates unseen. A narcissistic woman draws her power from this unconscious space. She manipulates emotions that have not yet been examined: guilt, longing, the need to be chosen, the fear of abandonment. As long as these forces remain unconscious, they control behavior. But emotional exhaustion forces consciousness. The mind, having suffered enough, begins to observe instead of react. At this stage, the victim no longer asks, "How can I fix this?" That question belongs to the hopeful. Instead, a quieter and more dangerous question appears: why am I participating in this at all? This shift marks the end of psychological captivity. When someone stops trying to win love, approval, or understanding, manipulation loses its entry point. There is nothing left to pull on. Clarity born from exhaustion is not optimistic clarity. It is sober clarity. It does not seek justice or validation. It simply recognizes reality as it is, and reality, once seen clearly, cannot be unseen. This is why emotionally exhausted individuals often appear cold or distant. In truth, they have become accurate. They are no longer interpreting behavior through emotion, but through pattern recognition. The narcissistic woman relies on emotional fog to maintain control, but exhaustion clears the fog completely. What remains is awareness, and awareness is lethal to manipulation, not because it fights back, but because it no longer plays. When illusion ends, power quietly changes hands, and the person who sees clearly is the one who decides what happens next. Once clarity has emerged, something even more unsettling follows. The emotionally exhausted victim reaches a point where loss no longer terrifies them. This is not because they have become indifferent, but because the worst has already happened internally. When someone has endured prolonged emotional strain, disappointment, and inner conflict, the fear of losing a person, an identity, or a future fantasy collapses. What remains is a psychological freedom that few people ever experience. A narcissistic woman maintains control through leverage. That leverage is built on fear. Fear of abandonment, fear of conflict, fear of being alone, fear of being misunderstood. But leverage only works when there is something left to threaten. An emotionally exhausted victim has already mourned the relationship while still inside it. They have already felt the grief, the confusion, the self-doubt. By the time they step back emotionally, there is nothing left to take away. Jung understood this state as a confrontation with the shadow, not the shadow of the narcissist, but one's own. The victim has faced their dependency, their tolerance for disrespect, their need to be needed. This encounter is painful, but it is also liberating. Once a person sees how much they sacrifice to maintain an illusion, they stop bargaining with reality. They stop negotiating their self-respect for temporary peace. This is why threats lose their power. Guilt no longer lands. Emotional outbursts feel theatrical rather than intimidating. The exhausted victim does not escalate or retaliate, because escalation requires emotional fuel, and that fuel is gone. What replaces it is calm resolve, a quiet certainty that survival does not depend on this dynamic continuing. This is deeply destabilizing to a narcissistic personality. Control fails not when it is challenged, but when it is irrelevant. When someone has nothing left to lose, they cannot be controlled, only witnessed. And in that moment, the balance of power shifts permanently, because the person who fears nothing emotionally is finally free to choose themselves. After fear dissolves and the need to hold on disappears, a subtle transformation occurs. The emotionally exhausted victim becomes quiet, not withdrawn out of weakness, but silent with intention. This silence is often misunderstood. It is mistaken for passivity, indifference, or even defeat. In reality, it is the moment where the psyche stops leaking energy into a system that has been draining it for far too long. A narcissistic woman thrives on reaction, attention, conflict, explanation, emotional defense. These are the lifeblood of control. Every response, even resistance, confirms relevance. Jung would say that what is fed by projection gains power. Silence removes the projection. It creates a psychological vacuum where manipulation has nothing to attach itself to. This silence is not punishment, and it is not a tactic learned from a book. It emerges naturally when the mind has reached saturation. The victim has explained themselves enough, proven their intentions enough, justified their feelings enough. Eventually, the psyche understands something essential. Expression without being heard is self-betrayal. Then becomes an act of self-respect. In this quiet, something remarkable happens. The narcissistic dynamic begins to collapse under its own weight. Provocations intensify. Emotional displays become more dramatic. Accusations grow louder. But without reaction, these attempts echo back emptily. The narcissistic personality is forced to confront an unfamiliar experience, invisibility. And invisibility feels like annihilation to a self built on external validation. Meanwhile, the silent individual is not empty at all. Internally, they are reorganizing. They are observing patterns instead of engaging in them. They are conserving energy, reconnecting with instinct, rebuilding a sense of inner authority. Jung believed that true power arises when consciousness withdraws from compulsive participation and reclaims the center of the psyche. Silence, in this context, is not absence. It is presence without permission. It communicates one thing with devastating clarity: you no longer have access to me. And when access is removed, control ends, not with noise, but with a door quietly closing from the inside. When silence settles and the emotional noise fades, pain does not disappear. Instead, it changes form. What once overwhelmed the nervous system begins to organize itself into understanding. This is the stage where emotional exhaustion completes its transformation, turning suffering into psychological strength. Not the loud strength of domination, but the quiet strength. Integration. Jung believed that pain, when consciously endured, becomes a teacher. When it is avoided or denied, it repeats. The emotionally exhausted victim has no energy left to run from discomfort. They sit with it. They examine it. And in doing so, they extract meaning from experiences that once felt chaotic. This is how wisdom is formed, not through comfort, but through sustained awareness. At this point, reactions lose their grip. The individual no longer responds automatically to provocation, guilt, or emotional pressure. Instead, there is a pause, and within that pause lies freedom. The mind begins to distinguish between what is being said and why it is being said. Behavior is no longer taken personally, it is understood structurally. Patterns replace accusations. Insight replaces outrage. This shift is deeply threatening to a narcissistic dynamic. Manipulation relies on emotional immediacy. It requires impulsive responses, blurred boundaries, and unresolved wounds. But when pain has been metabolized into understanding, those wounds close. The individual becomes difficult to destabilize, not because they are numb, but because they are grounded. What emerges is a kind of internal authority. Decisions are no longer driven by the desire to avoid discomfort or restore harmony at any cost. They are guided by alignment. The person begins to act from principle rather than emotion, from observation rather than impulse. This is not emotional detachment in the cold sense. It is emotional maturity. Jung described individuation as the process of becoming whole. This stage marks a critical point in that journey. The victim is no longer defined by what they endured, but by what they integrated. Pain has been reclaimed as power, not to control others, but to govern the self. And when a person can govern themselves, no external force can rule them again. As inner authority stabilizes, another profound shift takes place. The emotionally exhausted victim stops seeking validation, not as an act of rebellion, but as a natural consequence of self-recognition. When someone has spent long enough explaining their pain, justifying their reactions, and hoping to be understood by someone unwilling to understand, the psyche eventually withdraws that effort. It realizes that validation given reluctantly or strategically is not validation at all. It is control disguised as care. A narcissistic woman depends on this hunger for validation. Approval, affection, and acknowledgement are offered conditionally, keeping the other person psychologically dependent. As long as someone needs to be seen, chosen, or affirmed by the narcissist, they remain reachable, but emotional exhaustion dissolves this need. The individual no longer asks, "Do you see me now?" They ask, "Do I see myself clearly?" And that question changes everything. Jung would describe this moment as the withdrawal of projections. The victim stops projecting worth, authority, and meaning onto the other person. They reclaim those qualities internally. This is not arrogance or isolation. It is psychological completion. Self becomes its own reference point. Decisions are no longer filtered through the imagined reactions of another. This is where unpredictability emerges, not chaos, but independence. The narcissistic personality cannot calculate or manipulate someone who no longer seeks approval. Emotional hooks fail. Provocations fall flat. Even praise loses its power. The individual does not reject validation aggressively. They simply do not require it. And what is not required cannot be used as leverage. This internal shift often feels unsettling at first. There is a brief emptiness where external affirmation used to live. But that space is quickly filled with something more stable, self-trust. The person begins to act in alignment with their values rather than in response to emotional incentives. They choose truth over comfort, dignity over attachment, clarity over reassurance. When validation is no longer outsourced, freedom becomes non-negotiable. And the moment you stop asking to be seen is the moment you become impossible to control. At the final stage of this transformation, something unexpected happens. The emotionally exhausted victim does not become vengeful. They do not seek to expose, punish, or correct the narcissistic woman. Instead, they disengage with dignity. This is the most misunderstood and most dangerous outcome of all, because revenge would still mean emotional investment. And emotional investment is exactly what the narcissistic dynamic feeds on. Revenge keeps the bond alive. It says, "You still matter enough to provoke me." But the exhausted victim has moved beyond that psychological loop. They understand, often intuitively, that reclaiming power does not require domination. It requires separation. Jung would frame this as the final withdrawal of psychic energy from a destructive complex. The individual stops feeding what once consumed them. This does not mean forgiveness in a sentimental sense, nor does it mean forgetting. It means clarity without attachment. The person sees the narcissistic behavior accurately, without hatred and without hope. They no longer need the narcissist to change in order to heal. That dependency has dissolved. And this is precisely why the influence ends permanently. From the narcissistic perspective, this is intolerable. Rage, blame, and manipulation can all be managed. Indifference cannot. When there is no emotional reaction to provoke, no narrative to fight against, no role to play in the other person's inner world, control evaporates. The narcissist is left alone with themselves, while the former victim quietly moves on. What replaces revenge is self-respect. The individual invests energy where it can grow rather than where it will be consumed. They build a life that no longer revolves around explaining, defending, or proving. Their power is no longer reactive. It is directional. It moves forward. This is the true end of the cycle. Not victory over another, but sovereignty over oneself. No dramatic confrontation, no final speech. Just a decisive inner shift that makes return impossible. And that is the most dangerous outcome of all. Because when someone chooses self-respect over revenge, the past loses its grip, and the future finally opens.